What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my 5 favorite games of 2022. Specifically, games that released this year, which I specify because I played a lot of games, new and old, many of which I reviewed, but we are of course focusing on games that actually released this year. Of which, it must be said, there really wasn't a ton of big game releases this year. Most of what we saw were indies, and especially tactical RPGs saw a ton of releases. But as we wind down the year, I thought it would be fun to talk about some of the games that I personally enjoyed the most, before turning it over to you in the comments to hear about what games you enjoyed. And last but not least, before we dive into this thing, I will be doing a fun video in like a week or two where I rank every single game that I reviewed this year, which will include all the games I played new and old, but that list is mostly just for fun as it encompasses many different genres and is almost impossible to rank them all in any meaningful way, but it's fun and I enjoy doing it. So with all of that said, let's actually dive into this and talk about the games I enjoyed the most in 2022. We are kicking off the list with the one I imagine most people expected to be here, and this is Elden Ring. No real surprise that this one won Game of the Year recently, as it is pretty fantastic. And in it we see the open world formula applied to the Soulsborne likes, which I think it must be said worked surprisingly well for a game that had previously relied on more intense level design. I think the open world formula was translated in a really great way here that made it feel fresh, despite open world games themselves becoming a bit formulaic these days. Now, while a lot of people expected Elden Ring to be good, it honestly caught me off guard a little bit how much I enjoyed it, because I had played Soulsbornes previously, but they were never really my cup of tea. I could see why people enjoyed them, but generally speaking, I'm not wild about them. But the approach Elden Ring takes with the exploration of the open world, finding these dungeons that then lead into areas that can be explored, all these secrets to unveil, it just really hooked me in, and I played like 120 hours of it in like 2 weeks roughly. And when they inevitably release DLC for it, I'll probably jump back into it, as the only real reason I stopped playing this one is that they kept making tweaks to various weapons and things while I was trying to work on builds for videos. And after about the third one that I had to scrap because they changed something fundamental, I decided I had to spend my time a little more wisely, focusing on different things. So hopefully, when the DLC drops, we'll double back, talk about it a little more. But it's a game that I enjoyed thoroughly, like most people, so unsurprisingly it's on this list. But that brings us to our second entry, and this is actually Weird West, the supernatural Wild West immersive sim, which I was actually anticipating before its release, and rather unsurprisingly, I enjoyed it a lot. It's got elements from a lot of different games. At its core, I would definitely say it's an immersive sim, but it's also got a lot of CRPG elements to it, such as traversing a world map, hunting down enemies, that kind of thing. But the game itself is presented as an anthology. As you play through the game, you'll play one of 5 different characters with their own unique skill sets who can approach the open world and combat differently, which is an interesting spin. But the real standout for this title for me was the combat. It can be very explosive and chaotic. There's stealth if you want to lean into it, but oftentimes if you get spotted, the entire battle situation turns into just this big chaotic mess where you're trying to manage all these real-time elements with the aiming system and everything, as well as all the interactive elements that go into an immersive sim, such as fire spreading, being able to scale buildings, drop down chimneys, all that sort of stuff. They just give you so many options to approach the combat however you want that it feels like a ton of fun. Really, the only thing I didn't like about this game is that the anthology part of it kind of forces you to move on and play different characters. So if you really like one character, you can later recruit them as part of the new character's posse, if you will. But I kind of wish they had implemented a sort of free roam system where you could just pick a character and kind of mess around in the world using some of the Radiant like bounty quest systems that they had in place. I think that would be a fun way to play this game, which honestly the modding scene is already on. They did recently roll out modding tools for the community, and there's already some really cool ones in there. But I liked Weird West a lot, so it is of course on this list. And that brings us to our third entry, and this is Pentiment, the narrative RPG from Obsidian Entertainment, and I enjoyed it a great deal, though it is worth mentioning that it is a narrative RPG, which really isn't up everybody's alley. Oftentimes these are akin to visual novels where you just kind of play through a story, clicking various dialogues, that kind of thing, a sort of choose your own adventure book style game, and that's not going to appeal to everyone. But I do like the way it was presented. You're trying to solve a series of murders over about 25 years, and your avenues for investigation have consequences, forcing you to make choices, and the way it was strung together was quite neat. Also, it's set in, I think it was 16th century Bavaria, and there was a ton of research put into making that feel like an authentic place, and in fact, many of the side stories, if you will, are based on actual historical occurrences, obviously embellished a little bit for a game, but you can tell a ton of love was put into it. It was fun to engage with the systems, see how various choices play out, point the finger at various people, and while I don't think the game is going to change anybody's mind on what narrative RPGs are or anything, I enjoyed it a ton, and it was easily one of my favorite games this year. Then we have our fourth entry, and this is actually Circus Electrique, an interesting turn-based game that came out earlier in the year, where we manage a steampunk circus in London. Now, at its core, the game is quite similar to Darkest Dungeon, so if you like that, you'll probably like this to some degree. And we see ourselves both managing a circus, putting on performances for money and various other currencies for things like crafting, all the while trying to save the city of London from the vicious, which are people driven mad by various steampunk technologies, and we have to fend them off with our circus performers. And there's something like 15 different classes of performers that you can get and then customize a little farther based on their various traits, and you send them out to combat while also managing your circus. And it's a game that I enjoyed quite a bit. I do think it falls apart a little bit in the late game, where I think it could have used a bit more of a balance pass, but the vast majority of the game I had a lot of fun with. I think they nailed the art style and the aesthetic, and all of it blends together to make a game that I had a lot of fun playing through for the most part, outside of a few problems towards the end of the game in terms of balance on basically any difficulty. It was kind of possible to back yourself into a sort of unwinnable corner if you didn't know what you were doing. But I really enjoyed the combat, the circus management, the steampunk vibe. There was a lot here to enjoy, more so than there was to not enjoy, and combine that with the fact that the game's like $20, it was a pretty easy sell, which of course made it one of my favorite games this year. And then to top the list off, we have Expeditions Rome. This is a game I loved. It released back in January. It was the third installment of the Expedition series, the previous ones being Conquistador and Viking. And in Rome, we play as a stand-in for Julius Caesar, making various choices in the face of real events that the real-life Julius Caesar had to deal with, albeit with more artistic flair. I would not consider this a historically accurate game by any means. It takes a ton of liberties with that kind of stuff. In fact, a lot of it is presented out of order in terms of the timeline of events that these things actually occurred, and it even kind of leans into mythology here and there. But honestly, I think that helps make it feel more like a game, because we're going to be going around, exploring, making choices, handling things in various ways, deciding how our legion will deal with all sorts of things, and there's a ton of choice and consequence involved in what bills itself as a TRPG. But I would make the argument that this game is just a CRPG, and overall I had a blast with it, and that's before we even start talking about the combat. You might think that when you're dealing with sort of real-life units, that the combat could be boring, but even here they managed to present a system that was surprisingly deep and fun at the same time, which only got better when they released their DLC that added gladiators to the game as a new class and expanded things a little bit farther. But it's a game that I went in expecting a TRPG, and I came away with my expectations being blown out of the water, and I had a blast with it, which makes it a shame that we're unlikely to see more of this for a while at least, as the studio kind of imploded afterwards, as like half of the studio went to work on some NFT project, which, given the state of NFTs, went about as well as you could imagine. Though that said, the IP is owned by THQ Nordic, I believe, which means all hope is not lost. But if we get another game, it's definitely not going to be from the same team, I would imagine. So we'll kind of just have to see what happens here, as it would be a shame to see a series end like that after such an incredible game. Because honestly, Expeditions Rome is probably my favorite game this year. Though that said, my personal interests tend to skew more to the TRPG, CRPG genre, so probably not much of a surprise there for my regular viewers. But that, guys, is going to do it for this video. Those are my 5 favorite games that I played and reviewed this year. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. Of course, tell me all about your favorite games that you played this year, and in probably a week or so, I'll be doing, again, a fun video where I rank every game that I reviewed this year, new and old. But in the meantime, certainly hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.